Welcome back to the Think Wildlife podcast. Today's episode takes us to some of the most extraordinary and vulnerable ecosystems on the earth, islands. Joining me is David Will from Island Conservation, a global organization working to restore islands by tackling invasive species. We talk about why islands are biodiversity hotspots, how invasive rodents drive extinctions, the powerful links between land and sea, and how innovation from drones to genetic tools is transforming conservation worldwide. Let's dive in. Well, welcome, David, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
So, what got you interested into conservation?
That's a great question. I've always been someone who's passionate about the outdoors and did a lot of hiking and whatnot growing up. And I did my undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz, focused on kind of biology and computer science, and happened to get lucky and was looking for an internship doing GIS and conservation biology, and happened to find Island Conservation, which was based in Santa Cruz. Had an internship with them, and over the summer it turned into a job, and I've been there 16 years now. So just happened to be in the right spot at the right time.
So, currently, you're working at Island Conservation. So, what's the idea behind this organization?
Yeah, so Island Conservation, we're a global nonprofit whose mission is to restore islands and restore islands for nature and people worldwide. And we do that primarily by removing one of the biggest threats to islands, which are invasive species. So rats, cats, and pigs introduced to islands are a leading cause of extinction on islands and cause a whole variety of impacts, from reducing plants, reducing seabirds, causing species to go extinct. And we know that by removing those invasive species, we can see remarkable recoveries. We see species coming back for the first time in hundreds of years. We see native plants rebounding back quickly. And we're seeing this land and sea connectivity. So seeing seabirds come back has more guano from the seabirds that cascades into the marine environment, which creates more fish, healthier coral reefs. So we're really seeing these holistic benefits from removing invasive species on islands. And Island Conservation is the world's only nonprofit that's solely focused on partnering with communities and governments around the world to plan and implement these interventions as a foundational part of recovery, and then working with those partners and communities to continue to see benefits by restoring species, restoring plants to recover islands around the world.
So, what makes the biodiversity of islands so special?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Islands are these unique hotspots of biodiversity. They hold a disproportionate amount of the world's biodiversity, and have more unique species than anywhere else in the world. And they also hold, nearly 10% of the world's population. So there's these truly special spots that have species that exist nowhere else in the world. And yeah, that's one of the things that makes islands really so special, is that there's just so unique number of species that exist nowhere else in the world. And islands are also threatened by invasive species and by climate change, and by the failing ocean health, and are kind of bellwethers of the environmental and extinction crises that we're facing today. But they also offer hope, because we do know that we can remove these invasive species from islands, and we can see these tremendous rebounding effects. So they are kind of also these bellwethers of conservation action is possible and deliverable, and we can see remarkable benefits from these interventions.
So, you spoke about climate change and ocean health being a major threat to islands. Why is this the case, and why are islands more susceptible than other terrestrial ecosystems to human threats?
Yeah, I mean, obviously islands generally are much smaller than mainland systems, particularly if you're thinking about out in the Pacific, very remote locations that have more complex shorelines. They may not be as high of elevation, and oftentimes are in the main pathways for tropical storms and systems coming through. So they really have some unique exposures to the threats of climate change, and also because they are so remote, and all of the species that live on those islands play multiple functional roles, right? These have very unique and high amounts of species that live only on those islands, but oftentimes those species play multiple roles compared to a continental system where you have so many more species that exist. One species on an island might play more roles, and so losing that one species, like a seabird, for example, that's a major ecosystem engineer that provides guano to the marine environment, where there's no upwelling and nutrients that are available from nearshore waters. They are the main source of nutrients to coral reefs and so many times. But they're also providing nutrients to a lot of the native forest and vegetation that are on the island. And they're bringing seeds and other things around. So they're playing all of these multiple roles in some of those spaces. And so not only do some of the projected impacts of sea level rise, temperature rise, marine heat waves, and tropical storms are particularly acute for islands, but then the biodiversity itself, that the potential to lose one of those species on an island, either because of it going extinct from or being extirpated on the island from the removal of invasive species, or because its climate range is no longer tolerable and it's going to migrate to somewhere else. That can be a major impact to an island, more so than on a mainland continental system.
So, talk about, where does Island Conservation operate as an organization?
Yeah, so we have been around for about 30 years. We were started by two professors at UC Santa Cruz, Don Kroll and Bernie Tershi. They had been working on some islands in Mexico, and we're really seeing the huge impacts to some native seabird species on islands in Mexico, and thought that there was something that could be done about it. And they worked with some local partners to remove invasive species from those islands, and saw dramatic returns of those seabird populations on those islands. And we're really recognizing that there was a global community of other practitioners in New Zealand, the Seychelles, the Galapagos, that were starting to really emerge around this idea of restoring islands through the removal of invasive species. Since then, island conservation works in more than 15 different countries around the world, and we've been really working to help a number of island nations or nations with islands to implement some of their first interventions. And we have current projects in as far from Puerto Rico to Palau, New Zealand, Tonga, Samoa, the Marshall Islands, the Galapagos, and Chile. So we have a pretty broad portfolio of places and communities that we work with.
So, you mentioned about the removal of invasive species, and one of your projects is the genetic biocontrol of invasive rodents program. Talk a bit about this.
Yeah, so one of the foundational things that we're always working on is, how do we remove these invasive species from the island, with the idea of complete removal, so that it's a one-time intervention that can realize these benefits, doesn't require sustained effort. And obviously, when you're talking about removing invasive species, we have a variety of limited tools that are available to us today. And some of them have undesired or non-target effects. Some of them have risks to native species. They may have risks to people that require a significant environmental review and acceptance by stakeholders in the community, stakeholders in the government, to identify, are the risks appropriate? Can they be mitigated in certain ways? And are they socially acceptable to be able to make the project move forward? Because of all those sorts of things, we have a limited tool set. There are some islands that are too large for us to be able to do, or are too complex because of the potential risks, and they're not accepted by stakeholders in the community to be able to move forward. An example of that, just to give a context of the size of islands that we're talking about, one of the largest islands that has been done to date for a rodent eradication is South Georgia Island in the sub-Antarctic. It's about the size of Rhode Island. And it was possible by removing invasive species over 6 years. It was 3 different seasons that it was done by, and it was only possible because 60% of the island is rock and ice. And it was glaciers that were separating different portions of the island. And so the removal methods that we had, we were able to do that over sequence. But that is the largest island that's been done. And so from a global perspective, that's not a terribly large island. And so we do have real limits. And we've had some research that has shown that with the current tools available to us today, only about 15% of the world's islands that have threats of invasive species are feasible. So Island Conservation and partners in 2015 started to look at our horizon scanning exercise to identify what sorts of new tools and methods are there that are out there that would allow us to overcome some of these current challenges, and identified a series of different sorts of removal methods. And one of those was the future potential for genetic biocontrol methods using things such as gene drives. So for those that aren't familiar with a gene drive, these are naturally occurring genetic elements. And a gene drive just, normally when there's inheritance, things are split 50-50 between being passed from parents to the offspring, right? And gene drive has an increased amount of that inheritance, and meaning that rather than a 50-50 split, it might be a 75 or a 90%. So it really biases it towards propagating that one particular genetic element through a population. So the idea behind gene drives was, is there a way to use those naturally occurring selfish genetic elements and put it in such a way that it could remove the reproductive capacity of a population? And by doing that, if there was a way to introduce that into a population, you could see that population would eventually not be able to reproduce. It would be a more humane way of removing those invasive species from an island, and the population would eventually reproduce. It would not be able to reproduce anymore, and it would go locally extinct from that island. So Island Conservation and a series of other partners formed the Genetic Biocontrol for Invasive Rodents Consortium to just investigate this technology. Is this feasible? Is it practical? And then also, is it ethical and safe? And how could it be used safely and appropriately? So there's been a number of studies that have shown what is possible from those sorts of technologies, but also what is needed to be able to make it spatially contained, genetically contained, so that it would only affect a particular island population. And then starting to investigate with stakeholders, how could this technology be used? What are the ethical questions behind it? To really just to try and explore the feasibility of this, because this is many, many years away from happening. If there are communities and governments and stakeholders that decide it is something they want to pursue.
Talk about the Ocean Connection Challenge.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we've really realized over the last couple of years, or at least Western science has started to realize, is the connection between the land and the sea. And this is something that so many of our traditional island communities partners have known for generations and millennia. And Western science and modern science is just kind of catching up to quantifying that. So again, for example, there was a study in the Chagos Archipelago that showed that looked at a rat-free island versus a rat-infested island, and showed that the rat-free island had twice as much coral reef biomass and health, and more than 50% more fish biomass compared to a rat-infested. And so we're seeing that there's this demonstrable evidence that there are significant benefits to a non-invasive system that has more seabirds, that has more guano input going into the marine environment. And so Island Conservation and a series of partners, we published a paper in 2022 that talks about the land-sea connection and all of the ways that species such as seabirds and land crabs and others provide benefits to land and to sea, and the detrimental impacts of invasive species to causing erosion, to impacting nutrient cycles, and a variety of other impacts on islands. And we launched the Island Ocean Connection Challenge, which is a global campaign to restore 40 islands by 2030. and to demonstrate the land-sea connection potential from restoring those islands. So not only is it a campaign to really elevate the importance of land-sea connectivity and to restore those islands, but also working with local partners and Scripps Oceanography to do paired land and sea measurement monitoring over from now through the next 20 years to be able to demonstrate that when seabirds come back, that when native island systems are restored, we see this land-sea connectivity and we can measure and demonstrate that over time to really elevate the importance of island restoration. And our real hope is to catalyze a decade of island restoration to really see this proven method accelerated and celebrated around the world.
So one of the species island conservation works a lot with is the Audubon shearwaters. So talk a bit about your work with the species.
Yeah, so the Audubon shearwater, this is a project on Desecheo National Wildlife Refuge in Puerto Rico. It by all historical accounts, was one of the most significant seabird colonies in the Caribbean. If you read some of the historical accounts, there was darkened clouds of seabirds above the island from some of the early European voyagers that came through. And then obviously a series of invasive species, including goats and rats, were introduced onto the island and had serious detrimental effects. And today there's almost no, or very, very few seabirds on the island. So island conservation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a variety of other partners implemented a series of invasive species removal projects. I was fortunate enough to participate in some of those and even lead one of the interventions in 2017 to remove invasive rats from Desecheo. And since then, we have been monitoring the island for recovery, and our staff and local partners have established social attraction systems. So these are basically giant speakers put out onto the island to create what some call a seabird discotheque, to make loud seabird calls to really attract other seabirds within the region to come back. And what's been really exciting that we have just recently published is that the Audubon shearwater has come back and nested on Desecheo for the first time in nearly 100 years. And we've got documented evidence of the Audubon shearwater nesting on the island and multiple individuals coming back. So it's really, again, proof that these interventions do work and that we're seeing the recovery of species that hasn't happened in hundreds and hundreds of years, if ever, in some of these cases. And is moving us closer to that vision of seeing the clouds of seabirds come back on Desecheo to what it was once before.
So talk a bit about the innovations program.
Yeah, so my current role is as the Director of Impact and Innovation at Island Conservation. Innovation has been a core element of island conservation since our initial founding, and we were, as we described earlier, we had an innovation horizon scan that we led, and in 2020 we decided to formalize and develop an innovation program. So I have a staff of 2 other individuals on the innovation team, and our goal is to really identify promising near-term solutions that can increase the scale, scope, and pace of our work, and work with technology companies, with our partners, and with our projects to identify those ideas, test those, and implement them, and bring them into action, and hopefully see those that are the most promising come into widespread adoption. So we talked a little bit earlier about some of the genetic biocontrol ideas that we have been slowly investigating with some other partnerships. One of our other big investments has been in heavy lift drones. So one of the big challenges for the work that we do for, particularly for invasive rats, is that a lot of these are very remote islands. The main method that we have is to apply a highly specific conservation bait to the island to be able to remove the invasive rats. There's a lot of studies that need to go into identifying what are the risks, as we mentioned earlier, to the native species and to communities to be able to mitigate those. And when those can be successfully mitigated, the most effective way to be able to distribute this conservation bait to remove the invasive species is by helicopter. But you can imagine on many remote islands, taking a helicopter out into the middle of the Pacific requires large ships, breaking down helicopters, putting them into shipping containers, bringing them out, chartering them for multiple weeks to months on end, and then bringing them back, which is a huge exorbitant expense. And so helicopters for some of our remote islands is one of the main drivers of cost to implementing these interventions. So we identified that as drone technology was coming and increasing, that drones could be an incredibly more cost-effective way to be able to implement these interventions. And we started working with a company in New Zealand called Technologies, and we implemented in the Galapagos in 2019 the world's first drone-based eradication project. And so these are all-electric multi-copter drones that have about a 15-minute flight time, a 12-kilogram payload capacity, and then pre-programmed to fly along an island and distribute the conservation bait across the island. Since 2019, with some support from some funders, we have been able to really scale that to now more than 13 islands around the world to implement these projects. And because these drones are small, they can be broken down, carried as checked luggage onto an airplane, commercial airplane, rebuilt onto an island, used on small boats. And because of this, we've had a 60% increase in the number of interventions we've been able to do in the last 5 years. And we had 6 projects that were previously unattainable because helicopters did not exist in country and the cost was too much, that we've now been able to accomplish. And so in this case, that investment into drone technology has really made a huge difference in our ability to deliver more projects and projects that we previously were not able to implement. And we've been continuing to work with other drone companies on larger drones, up to some that have hybrid drones that could go for 2 hours, some that are gas, and even almost a helicopter replacement sort of drone size. So looking at how can we scale this technology to be more reliable, more cost effective, and a broader marketplace of drones around the world. One of the other main challenges for us is obviously how do you confirm that invasive species are removed, right? So it's not just is there a needle in a haystack? It's a harder question of is there no needle in the haystack? And so more than 30% of our project budgets are spent on trying to detect and remove and confirm that invasive species are absent from an island. And so we have been investigating into the use of thermal drones, hyperspectral imagery to detect species, real-time enabled camera traps with Conservation X Labs. And these are cameras that can be placed out in the field, have onboard AI recognition capabilities to detect invasive species and then send satellite signal saying that they've detected something. And we just published some research in BMC biology describing new uses of eDNA, which is environmental DNA that allows you to detect mice from environmental samples such as water, soil, or even swabs of leaves, and being able to say, are there mice present on the island, and get, as you sample from that environmental DNA that collects up in the environment, get relative of distribution of the invasive species, but also if you have those sorts of things collected over time, an estimate of relative abundance of eDNA signal of prevalent is the population and how much are they moving around. So we're really seeing that these sorts of technologies provide new insights, and Island Conservation's really major role is working with these technology developers as an early adopter and integrating them into decision making. So how do we take these technologies and not just apply them and say, hey, that's really cool, but how do we use them to drive conservation decision making, increase effectiveness, and reduce decision making time, and allow us to do more projects. So a lot of really exciting developments from the innovation programs.
And what have been some key challenges you have faced as an organization?
And there's always so many different challenges. Now, obviously, these projects are incredibly complex that require years and years of planning. I think it can't be understated that some of these interventions, they are driven by the communities. They are the final decision makers. They are the ones that are wanting to make these interventions done. And so there's a huge amount of element of community engagement to sit down with island communities, go door to door, understand what their values are, what's their vision for a particular island, a vision for a particular place. How do invasive species impact that? How important is invasive species versus the other challenges that they face? And how can we work with them to support their vision of the island could look like? And then again, given the tools and methodologies that we have, is it possible to be able to achieve an invasive species eradication on these islands? And how do we work collaboratively with them to understand the project, to sustain the project and realize the outcomes? Because I think one of the other main challenges that's worth highlighting is all of these invasive species came to the island largely because of people, whether it was intentional or unintentional, that whether it was by boat, by plane, intentional introductions, people were the main reason that these invasive species came out to the island. And so removing invasive species in and of itself is just part of the solution, and that without full community buy-in for what's called biosecurity, which is constant vigilance, surveillance, and monitoring and mitigation of those pathways, we can't sustain these projects. And so there's a huge amount of behavioral change that is required of checking your boats before you leave, checking the bottom of your boots for different sorts of seeds or other things. Biosecurity is a challenging thing to be able to do because it's mostly about behavior change and getting a large buy-in from communities and stakeholders to invest in ways to prevent the problem from happening in the first place. There's some real examples of that. In the Aleutians in Alaska, there have been what's called rat spills, which is large boats that have run aground that had rats on them, and coming out, the potential for them to be invaded onto islands that are so large that if they became an established population, we wouldn't be able to remove them. And so there are, in some places like Alaska, there are rat spill responses that there are federal agencies and community members that as soon as a ship runs aground, there's immediate investigations, traps put out, cameras put out, other detection devices, sometimes dogs that are able to sniff rats to be able to detect them so that we can prevent population from establishing and prevent that problem from coming back or establishing for the first time.
And how can individuals contribute to island conservation?
There's so many different ways to contribute to island conservation. Obviously, we love support for our Island Ocean Connection campaign and being able to support directly some of our conservation projects on the ground. But I think that, the other thing is just elevating the importance of islands, that these are truly remarkable, special places that hold unique biodiversity, and thinking about how do we continue to promote that islands are this beacon of hope in an era of a whole number of different environmental crises, and promoting the stories that islands show, which is when you do these one-time interventions, you see ecosystems come back, you see species returning for the first times in hundreds of years, you see healthier coral reefs and communities that have improved food security and improved livelihoods. And so just cascading that message of hope that island restoration is possible and one of the most effective conservation interventions that we can do today would be an incredible thing for people to support.
And my final question is, what is your favorite memory from your conservation career so far?
My favorite memory. I think one of the earliest memories that I had was on an island in Isla de la Plata, where we were working for we were there probably 6 to 8 weeks. And we had every day, but to the start of the day, we had to hike up a hill, a really steep hill to get up to the top of that and to get over to the other side. And there was a shelter up on top of the hill that you could rest in after hiking up that hill. And so every day we would hike up that hill, and there was a blue-footed booby, a juvenile blue-footed booby that was there every day, that we would get to interact with. And it just seemed like very familiar, and we would want to come up and say hello. And we were there so long that the juvenile booby learned to fly, and I was there to be able to see it run and jump off the edge of the cliff and take its first flight, to be able to go off and catch fish and kind of grow up. And so it was this really remarkable thing to have been out on an island so long enough that you felt familiar with the species and animals that were out there, and to experience that kind of first moment of flight for one of those species that you're trying to protect. And it's something that still sticks with me today.
So that is a final question I had for you for this interview. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Just thank you so much for the opportunity, and I really appreciate it.